Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek for Breakthrough News, and this is Dispatches. I'm super excited to welcome to the show Camila Escalante and Ollie Vargas, both excellent journalists at Kawsachun News, joining me from Bolivia. You guys, welcome.
Thank you so much for having us. And we really love Breakthrough News. It's definitely one of the best, if not the most important news outlet covering U.S. issues. And it's so great that you guys make space for other issues, including Latin America as well.
Well, thank you for saying that. I'm super excited about what you guys are doing at Kawsachun News. It's like indispensable. It's English language information, what's happening from the ground, from a perspective that isn't being funded by Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post or at the Wall Street Journal. And there's a lot I want to talk to you guys about. I want to get into recent developments in Bolivia and Venezuela. Also, I want to get your take on the CIA woke ad that's been all the rage online this week. But first, I want to talk about the situation in Colombia. And just a brief overview for those who are watching. Over 20 people have been killed by security forces in Colombia. By the time this airs, it probably will be more people in protests that began against a proposed tax reform by the right-wing US-backed government of Ivan Duque. But these protests have since transformed into anger at the brutal police response, growing poverty, growing unemployment, and police have reportedly been using live ammunition. Videos have surfaced showing Colombian police gunning down protesters. There's been little, if any, backlash so far from the usual organizations that we constantly see, demonizing countries like Venezuela. You could imagine the response, right, if Venezuelan protesters had been gunned down like this in this large of a number. But, the media is either so far, as you guys have noted, has whitewashed or outright ignored this. Ollie, you even tweeted, and I don't know if this still stands, but that the Wall Street Journal South America correspondent based in Bogota hasn't said a thing about the 20-plus anti-neoliberal protesters killed this week in his own backyard. So I guess we can start off. I'd love to hear from you guys. What's your read on the situation in Colombia? Why are these protests happening now? Why are they continuing? Will there be consequences for the current government and its U.S. sponsor? And why is it being ignored? I know that's like a million questions in one, but just some points I'd love for you to hit on.
So yeah, these protests erupted this past week over a tax reform proposed by the right-wing president Ivan Duque. And this tax reform is basically about raising taxes on the general population, on working class people, to pay for basically the economic reconstruction, post-COVID, post-pandemic economic reconstruction. And of course, people began to ask, well, why should the people who suffered most during this pandemic be the ones who bear the brunt for the recovery, well, the ones who pay for the recovery, whereas other countries such as Argentina and elsewhere are introducing measures such as a wealth tax and other such policies. Whereas in Colombia, they're essentially implementing a sort of austerity measure, regressive taxation, and that was the trigger for people to come out onto the streets on a mass scale all across the country. But really, it was only a trigger because these protests have morphed into something much larger. The anger that people came out with onto the streets was always about the inequality that Colombia has as a country that's been under neoliberalism for as long as neoliberalism has existed. Anger as well at the sort of violence that's become completely normal, or that has been completely normal for a very long time, emanating from these sort of state-aligned narco sectors, paramilitary groups. And the pandemic, I think, has brought it all to the fore, because Colombia is a country, is a neoliberal country, free market model. And that meant that when the pandemic hit, most of the tax base for which the government draws an income was destroyed as businesses closed down, people became unemployed. So the government was left with, how do we fix, our problem of the fact we don't have enough revenue? We're not bringing in enough money to fund the sort of things that a government funds. In Colombia's case, you could say funds the sort of military apparatus that it's used to. And the problem that Colombia faced was that it's a neoliberal country. It doesn't have big state industries. So, for example, Bolivia has numerous state industries and natural resources, manufacturing, and those provide the majority of the government's revenues. It doesn't come from taxation, whereas Colombia doesn't have that. It's a free market economy, so they have to raise the revenues from somewhere else. They're not going to touch the richest section of the population, so they have to take it from the poorest, from a country in which now over 40% living in poverty, below the poverty line.
Wow.
So it's
That's
become,
a huge number.
yeah, and it's something that's spiked, particularly with the pandemic, with lockdowns, pushing people into unemployment, people being locked away hungry, without support from the government, imprisoned in their own homes, unable to feed themselves. So this is the sort of context of some of what's been going on.
This comes amid you guys froze. Okay, you're good. This is on top of violence that's been taking place in Colombia that's gotten almost no, if any, it's gotten almost no attention, which is, last year alone, you had the killing of over 200 social activists, environmental activists were killed in Colombia by forces that are believed to be connected to the state. So there's this ongoing violence in the backdrop as well. I saw today there was an article about the number of Colombian refugees seeking asylum in Spain has exploded from fewer than 700 in 2016 to nearly 28,000 in 2020. And a lot of that has to do with the violence as well as the poverty. And I guess Colombia doesn't get any attention at all because it's a U.S. client state. It's very close with the Americans. Very quickly, I just wanted to show on the screen this interesting graphic about just showing how much aid Colombia gets from the U.S. and what kind of aid it is. 1 second. I'm sorry, I'm getting used to using StreamYard, so I'm still not that savvy. Let's see. Here it is. Okay. So this is a pretty wild graph. Do you guys see it?
Yep.
Okay, so that's $412.90 million, and that's for 2020 Kron. It's the requested funding. And if you look at the specifics, you click here, that alone, 322 million of that, almost all of it, is for peace and security. And then actually that's broken up to counter narcotics. So you've got this huge amount of funding that's actually going to Colombia from the US, which is basically funding their police forces under the auspices of fighting a drug war. But then now we see it's actually being used against protesters.
Absolutely. And that's part of the continuation of the 11.6 billion that was assigned to Colombia in US foreign aid assistance from 2000 to essentially 2019. And 10 million of that was directed towards Plan Colombia and other subsequent programs. And so that's our understanding of why or where this high levels of violence was born. This is not something that could have existed without the training, cooperation, close cooperation and partnerships with the US government, its agencies, and its military. And those figures, 11.6 billion, I don't believe that includes the amount of resources that are not calculated in dollars, such as the number of US troops and advisors, both military advisors, anti-drug program advisors from the US and other people as well, working out of the US Embassy and of course in the DEA stationed around the Colombian territory. So obviously this violence has been a long time coming. And of course, you said that there's been a spike in recent years of Colombians heading out to the exterior and seeking refuge from the high levels of violence. But of course, our understanding here in South America is that has always been the case. Where we lived previously in Ecuador, that's pretty much the group that was stigmatized before Venezuelans has always been Colombians. Colombians have always sought refuge in the US, in Canada, and in all countries of Latin America, specifically in the neighboring countries of South America, of course, Venezuela in particular, Ecuador in particular. And so, people have always, at least in this region, have tried to gain an understanding of what's been going on there based on the right-wing media portrayals, which of course we know are highly inaccurate. But yeah, going back to the levels of violence we've seen, it's been very difficult for human rights defenders to be able to precisely calculate the figures of the number of people who've been killed by state forces, the number of people who've been abducted, disappeared, or missing since the protests began. They don't know how many people have been injured or have severe injuries or other damages. Because, of course, human rights defenders and independent journalists or journalists who are associated with community media or alternative media are being targeted as well. So it's been a very difficult situation on the ground. And of course, the big right-wing media is what is broadcasted all around the country. And they're the ones who are driving home the idea that the people are out in the streets carrying out vandalism, and that, in fact, the police are getting attacked and not the other way around, even though 100% of the deaths, whatever the figure may be at this point, have been deaths of protesters and bystanders.
So I want to go back. I wanted to get your understanding of, I mentioned before that this is, the violence against social activists was taking place before these protests, right? There was over 200 people killed last year, received almost no attention. I think Human Rights Watch wrote like a blurb about it, but nothing more than that. But I know this is not related necessarily to these protests at all, but since I've got you guys on, and that's an issue that's gotten no attention, why has that been happening? Because there was a peace deal that went into effect in Colombia a few years ago. And it seemed to do the opposite of peace, because you've just seen all these activists who put down their weapons basically murdered.
Well, there's been no implementation of the 2016 peace accords. This is the legacy of the Ivan Duque government. Obviously, this was a peace accord that was negotiated between the previous government of Juan Manuel Santos. But this is exactly what the Bolivarian government of Venezuela has been saying for years, that there are areas of lawlessness and complete absence of the Colombian state throughout Colombian territory. Colombia's territory geographically is not so different from that of Bolivia and Ecuador and Venezuela. In this report that was released in December of 2020, this Western Hemispheric report on drug assessment report, it talks about Colombia, and there's a whole section that talks about the geography of Colombia, and says that it's because of that geography that armed groups, of course, they mentioned left-wing groups and other armed groups. They don't say that these are, they don't really describe the characteristics or try to characterize what kind of armed groups we're talking about, except that they do refer to leftist groups. But they say that, they are able to control large areas of Colombia because of the geography. Well, that's unbelievable. I know exactly what Brazil is like. I've been in very remote areas of this entire continent in many countries, and it's all pretty similar. So the reason why there's an absence of the state is because where there are local authorities and there are security forces, they're working and harboring those paramilitary groups, and they're able to take control of large areas of the territory, and this includes the border with Venezuela and the border with Ecuador. And there has been a huge resurgence in crime on the Ecuadorian and Colombian border. And the reason we don't hear about it very often is because the right-wing media and the authorities in Ecuador don't dare to speak about the fact that the conflict in Colombia is actually spilling over into Ecuador as well. So it's left to the Venezuelan authorities to denounce this. But the fact is that it's spilling over in every direction.
So this is basically, you're saying, an absence because of a deliberate absence of the state.
Yes, it's because of the cooperation between the DEA. This is exactly what has been denounced by local human rights defenders, by leftist politicians in Colombia itself, senators and legislative authorities, and the Bolivarian government. They have all said that the only way in which these paramilitary camps can exist, these are large camps. We're talking about large areas of land where they do training, and they're not covered. It's not like a coliseum that's enclosed. Anyone can fly over, including the military of Colombia, and see the activity that is taking place. And they have in no way, they have in no way stood to block those operations from expanding.
And there's also there's a lot of close economic issues related to this. So one big activity that these paramilitary groups have been doing for decades is, massacring entire towns, indigenous towns, clearing them out. And who takes the land after that is often right-wing politicians attached to ruling parties, both at the government level or at regional government levels. And the current governor of one of the most violent states, called Antioquia, he's someone who benefited the most from taking land of people who are displaced, taking it virtually for free, and that's how he built his family fortune. So there's this nexus between all of these groups, and of course the issue of drugs is key as well, because Colombia is a country which has the largest number of US military bases and DEA presence in South America, but is the country that's had the largest increases in drug production over the past 6 years. So, past 6 years, we've seen a spike in drug production and an increasing presence of the US. So how can this be? Another country where this is true is Peru as well. Peru is the second largest producer of cocaine that reaches the United States. And it's the same situation. DEA, US military bases everywhere. What's the only result is the drug production goes up. So there's this, hidden link of cooperation between all of it that creates a permanent violence that benefits a lot of people, because a country that's permanently plunged into violence is a country that's permanently in fear, and that can be more easily controlled, and more excuses to bring more troops and more military presence from the United States and elsewhere. So all of this has been a cycle that's gone on for decades. It's not new, it's gone on for decades. And people are fed up. People have always been fed up, but people, I think, have got a bit more confidence to come out and do it and say it.
Yeah, and just staying on the drug production, that was the whole idea behind Plan Colombia. And they stated originally in 1999 that they wanted to reduce drug production and coca production and drug production, cocaine production, by 50%. That was their original goal. And two decades later, it had increased by something like 35%. And so this is with the increased militarization of the country and with increased U.S. Southcom presence around Colombia. And this is exactly what the party of Pedro Castillo in Peru is making its stance on when they say that they want to kick out U.S. forces. They want to make sure that the U.S. military and USAID is out of Peru. They're saying that based on the experiences of Bolivia and the experience currently of Colombia. They say that while drug production is only increasing around the country, there's so much military in all of these regions, and they're flying right overhead. Who has the ability to allow these small planes and aircrafts to fly over the territories and move the drugs in and out of the country and make the deals? Only the military can allow that. And so this is why it's a problem in Peru. And they say that the clear reason to stop that is to make sure that the US is out of the country.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? Wherever the US goes to narco traffic or to fight, do counter narcotics, you have a rise. I mean, it's unbelievable. It really makes what the US says completely laughable. I want to expand this a bit since you're talking about the rest of the region. This also has a lot to do with Colombia's role in the region. I mean, it is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it receives the most aid from the US. And it is the closest with the US in Latin America. I remember a few years back, the former president of Colombia actually proudly stated that that his country is the Israel of Latin America, which I thought was funny, but it's actually very true. So how would you describe Colombia's role in the region?
Yeah, I think as the Israel of Latin America is a really interesting comparison. I think there's a lot of truth to that, because the role of Colombia is not, the United States presence in Colombia is not just about controlling the internal affairs of the country. They use Colombia to destabilize the rest of the region. Colombia is a key component of the attacks on Venezuela. The attacks we saw last year, the so-called humanitarian aid. That was something brought in from Colombia with the Colombian authorities. And the sanctions, implementing the sanctions relies on the cooperation of Colombia as a country that shares a border with Venezuela. And, Colombian forces also now, the past few months, involved in training the security forces in Haiti, which have been carrying out a similar level of violence as we've seen currently in Colombia. So they're really exporting this sort of narco state model to the rest of the region, and that's incredibly useful for the United States. And that's it's a similar role in a different context, of course, as the role that Israel plays. Israel as a sort of attack dog for the United States within the region, and I think there's a lot of similarities with the way that Colombia is used.
You mentioned Venezuela and that humanitarian aid mission last year, which all of us stated was blatant propaganda and was an attempt at regime change. And then ultimately you actually had, I believe it was an investigation by the USAID itself stating that Richard Branson aid concert where Juan Guaido looks super coked up to try to basically enter Venezuela was all propaganda. But bringing in Venezuela, there is this recent news in the New York Times that I know you guys saw about the lawlessness, which goes back to what you were talking about, Camila, the lawlessness on the border areas of Venezuela. And they tried to portray it as, the Venezuelan government, for some reason, isn't able to, provide welfare for these remote areas of the border anymore. I don't know why. Apparently it has nothing to do with sanctions. They just suddenly became bankrupt and unable to provide electricity. But the point is they were making it sound as though these groups in Colombia are providing stability for the border areas of Venezuela. And as a result, the big mean Venezuelan government is launching a military campaign and is just crushing people. I think Human Rights Watch may have written a report about it as well, complaining that, people are being brutalized on the border by the Venezuelan military. Can you guys, what's actually happening there? What's actually happening at the border between Venezuela and Colombia?
What's actually happening is the Bolivarian National Armed Forces are protecting Bolivarian territory. They are protecting the country from criminal elements that come from Colombia, most of which are just straight up paramilitaries that are directly or indirectly linked to the Colombian state and which are allowed to do whatever they want because they're being used in order to wage a war against Caracas from the border and try to, weigh on the forces, the defense forces of Venezuela in order to have them spread extremely thin. They experience from time to time aggressions from the Brazilian border. Of course, the U.S. is always trying to strengthen their partnerships with Guyana. And of course, in the Caribbean Sea, they're also doing, supposed counter-narcotics patrols. And the gravest threat is, of course, coming from Colombia. But this is a very large and unfortunately porous border. And so it really, puts a strain on the Venezuelan military, and they know that they do that. And so they're allowing these groups to roam free and wage attacks and to try to gain ground in Venezuela without intercepting them in any way. And so that's exactly what's going on. This is, from the perspective of Venezuelan diplomats to the military and everyone else, they have said the same, that their one and only objective is to protect Venezuelan people, to protect the border, and not allow these groups to come in and operate freely the way that they operate freely throughout all of Colombia.
And of course, all of this is happening under the Biden administration. You mentioned Plan Colombia, which is a project that Biden took credit for during his campaign. Can you talk a little bit about what Plan Colombia was? Biden has talked about expanding that to other countries in Latin America. And then also, what, if anything, has changed under Biden, or has nothing changed for Latin America?
Yeah, nothing has changed. And so it was Plan Colombia was framed as the largest and longest lasting bilateral cooperation program in the Americas. And it had two objectives. One was to reduce cocaine production, and the second was counterinsurgency. And so it obviously, more than failed, if not succeeded, depending on how you want to name it.
Right.
In their first objectives, which was around drugs. Obviously, now drug production has skyrocketed. In terms of wiping out the FARC, it's continuing to do that right now by killing peace signatories. And so, even in this report that was released on Plan Colombia in December, they did say that that what has actually happened was there has been a record number of massacres in 2020 specifically, and the people who have been killed during the massacres and also just assassinations in general have been social leaders, former combatants, peace signatories, campesinos, largely indigenous and Afro-descendant people in the rural areas. And largely that money was distributed through USAID in Colombia. And so they are trying to, they've been continuously trying to copy the model that they used in Colombia and different countries through the use of USAID. And they're doing so right now in a very fast manner in El Salvador. And El Salvador is another country where the only reason why the level of brutalization, repression against the people, and there were so many people killed. The figures of people who were killed during the Civil War and who were killed by right-wing death squads during that period are just can't be compared in any other situation. It's a very small country where a very large people were executed extrajudicially by the state or had to leave the country altogether, draining all of everything from the country. And this is exactly what they've done to Colombia as well. And so they right now, since Nayib Bukele came into power, they've been strengthening these partnerships. So not to give too much context on what's going on, but obviously there's a little bit of a situation in El Salvador where he's a bit of he is an autocrat, and he has been since before he became president, and we knew that was very clear. And so the U.S. government is pretending to denounce some of his actions to try to take control of all of the branches of power. But apart from doing that, since he came into the presidency, they have been strengthening ties militarily and allowing more and more U.S. forces to control Salvadoran territory, which is very key, especially because they're working against ultimately Nicaragua and trying to, they're trying to ensure that the U.S. sphere of influence remains, prominent in the region, despite the government of Comandante Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. So they want to take control of that whole region and turn it to what they turned Honduras into with the coup. And so they're just going country by country and doing that. And I think I don't know, to the extent to which US citizens understand the way in which US agencies and all these different fronts that are associated with the State Department and the CIA expand and expand and expand and grow. And more money goes into it, into building a presence in all these different countries, including all parts of Africa, all parts of Latin America, in order to install what they call, U.S. democratic ideals. But it's a very difficult process to reverse. And this is something that countries like Venezuela and Bolivia are grappling with right now, is thank God U.S. forces were kicked out of these two countries, because if not, we would be looking the way Colombia is now.
Yeah, I mean, especially with Bolivia. Bolivia kicked out USAID back in 2013, I think. And now it's really unnerving because Samantha Power was just sworn
yesterday,
in, right, as head of the USAID, and she's a really scary figure. I imagine you guys would agree, given her history of support for regime change everywhere. But particularly, she was the UN representative. She was the UN representative for the US during the Obama years. She was constantly demonizing and advocating for sanctions against countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Iran, and basically any country that stands up to US hegemony. But you mentioned Bolivia and Venezuela. I mean, they essentially are standing up to prevent their countries from being turned into El Salvador, Honduras, Colombia, all the awful things you just stated. You guys are based in Bolivia. There was a report that came out today about the fact that the U.S. Department of Justice under Trump actually threatened to criminally prosecute two of the MIT researchers who had written a report for the Center for Economic and Policy Research to debunk Bolivia's electoral fraud claims, which isn't surprising that would happen under Trump. It's actually a little bit funny. I know I shouldn't laugh at it, but I can't help it because it's a very Trumpian thing to do. But that said, we know obviously there was a coup in Bolivia, and the Mass Party was able to win back the country in elections after there were so many massacres under the fascist coup government. But now that that's taken place, Bolivia has been trying to put in place some mechanism of justice. Janine Áñez was arrested, and you saw these human rights organizations that are really just tools of America, like Human Rights Watch, and of course OAS, get all upset that she was arrested. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it was covered inside of Bolivia? Was it covered the way it was in the US? Because it was it was like a parody. They were upset because a fascist coup plotter who led massacres was arrested. That was apparently anti-democratic.
Yeah, of course, and this is another point of continuation between the Trump administration and the current government. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made formal, statements, calling for the liberation of Janine Áñez, which is, it's a case of persecution. Bolivia is sliding into authoritarianism, whereas, the U.S. government or the Democratic Party, when they're in opposition, never made any statements in favor of the people who are actually being persecuted. More than 500 people detained under Janine Áñez, 2 massacres, numerous other deaths in other parts of the countries. It never solicited even a comment. And now and it's not just the United States. The European Parliament passed a motion was proposed by a party called Vox in Spain, which is a neo-Francoist, so neo-fascist party, really extreme, so fascism in the traditional European sense. They proposed a motion in the European Parliament calling for the release of Áñez, and it got passed. It got passed by a majority in the European Parliament. And, of course, Evo Morales actually made a statement today in response to that, saying, Bolivia is an independent country, and, Europe has been trying to impose itself here for over 500 years, and this is the latest example of it. So I think we have to look at all of the centers of power from where these attacks are coming from, and they are the United States and the European Union. European Union has played a key role in legitimizing the OAS report that we now know was completely flawed and manipulated in 2019. The European Union recognizes Juan Guaidó as president of Venezuela, despite all evidence to the country, as a political statement against Latin America. So the European Union, I think, is just as involved, maybe not to the scale as the US, but is wanting to get an even larger foothold than it already had in Latin America. So that's something to keep an eye out for. The news of the Trump administration was threatening the researchers who, released a report proving that there was no electoral fraud under Evo Morales. Well, at least we know that the truth did prevail in the end. The truth normally does prevail, normally too late, but luckily it did manage to prevail at the time. And that report was incredibly important because it gave Bolivians on the ground who are being persecuted a source for something they already knew, which was that there had not been electoral fraud, and Evo Morales was overthrown in an illegal manner by a tiny right-wing elite. So, I'm glad that report was able to be released. it provided a lot of confidence for Bolivians who were fighting in the ground at the time.
And now that, I think I talked to you recently, Ollie, about the elections in Ecuador. And we had talked about how there's a certain resilience that the movements in Bolivia and Venezuela have, that's like more based on the ground, more mass appeal. How is that working out? You guys are both in Bolivia now. How's that working out in Bolivia post-elections? Now that the Mass Party is back in charge, there was a lot of damage done under the Áñez government. Is that reversible? Are they trying to reverse it? And how has the right-wing backlash been since that election didn't go their way?
Well, I think the main task for the new government was rebuilding the economy, because under Áñez, the economy completely collapsed. When the coup took place, Bolivia was the fastest growing economy in South America. And within a few months, unemployment had tripled. All of the state industries had been paralyzed. That's to say that the factory gates have been closed on really key state-owned, strategic projects, development projects, and that slowed down, or it completely crashed the country's high GDP growth rate. And then the pandemic hit, and then they imposed strict lockdown without any support for the people who had lost their incomes. That caused an even more dramatic economic crisis. So now the main task is to rebuild the economy. And yeah, it's not an easy thing. It's going to take a long time. But it's a similar situation that, Evo Morales inherited in 2005, and where the current president, Luis Arce, was economy minister at the time, and they rebuilt the economy from nothing. So a big focus at the moment is reactivating the state industries that were closed under Áñez. So that includes, for example, Latin America's largest glass factory in the department of Chuquisaca that was opened a few months before the coup, but then closed under the Áñez regime as part of their effort to roll out the free market. It was closed down, and the government has just reopened it. That's thousands of new jobs, providing. It'll mean that Bolivia no longer has to import glass, that's for bottles, etc. It now produces its own. And there's a number of initiatives just like that all across the country, and all of them were closed down. And now the task is reactivating them. And I saw just today, Luis Arce communicated that there's actually a factory making alpaca wool for making jumpers and things like this. And that's state-owned. There's another thing that was closed under Áñez, and today it was just reopened. So all of those things, once they are reopened, can provide revenues. The profits from selling these things goes to the state. The state can then use that for poverty reduction, etc. So this is about rebuilding from a very, very low point, and to get back to the point where the country was. It's going to take quite a long time, but it's, things are moving.
And I guess real briefly, how's Venezuela holding up? I know it's a really big question, but obviously we're still in a pandemic. I've actually been quite impressed with Venezuela's numbers and ability to keep it under control, given their current economic situation. But they're still under heavy, crippling sanctions. Have they even been able to vaccinate or get vaccines into the country?
Yeah, just this week they've gotten a large number. I can't recall what the figure is, but a large number of vaccines, of the Sputnik vaccine from Russia. And so that's been really key. But of course, Venezuela has been, was probably the most proactive country in the entire region, apart from, if you make your way up to Cuba, that foresaw all of the issues that this coronavirus would bring and implemented so many different measures from the very beginning. And that includes beginning to look for vaccines as soon as it was known that vaccines were being approved in different parts of the world. And of course, that partnership with China and Russia has been very important, among others, and they'll be producing the Soberana vaccine that Cuba, at least the first one, if not some of the other ones that Cuba is producing as well. So it will be one of the countries that is, vaccinated in the near future. And so that's really important. They're continuing to deal with the blockade. And I think, again, it's important to remember that the sanctions that turned into the blockade began under President Obama. And so from the perspective of of Latin America. I think it's very just ridiculous that we continue to like ask this question. This question continues to be posed about whether or not things can or would change under a Biden regime. There's absolutely no way that it would change, because obviously he's just continuing his previous policies, and that we've just seen absolutely no change. I mean, I could just go about my day and I wouldn't know the difference between the two administrations. In any country of this region, it's very difficult. The only significant thing that, you know, really made a difference to the peoples of Latin America was the partial normalizations of relations with Cuba under the end of the Obama regime.
And they're not even doing that. You know, I think there's even people within the Democrats asking, why can't we at least go back to the setup that was under Obama, where there was a small alleviation of sanctions on Cuba? But what we've actually seen is a continuation of the Trump-Almagro policy, which represents a radicalization compared to Obama. Of course, Obama was still under the Obama administration, still played the same role in the region. But Trump specifically radicalized a lot of the attacks on countries like Venezuela and Cuba. And Joe Biden has continued that.
It's like there's no going back. It's like once it moves to the right, it just stays there. It doesn't change. I mean, there's a complete parallel with the Middle East too. Like, we haven't gone back to the Iran deal. That was like the one decent thing under Obama, right? Was this like alleviation of sanctions on Iran, which could be compared to the normalization with Cuba in some ways. And then but everything else stays the same. I mean, Trump went into overdrive with Israel, moving the U.S. embassy. That's not changing. All these normalization deals between Israel and these Gulf state countries, still arming Saudi Arabia, still arming the UAE. Like, nothing's changed. It's a really good point, Camila, that you say you could just go about your day and not notice a difference. I feel the same way living in the Middle East. And so it's odd, the conversation sometimes from abroad that you see among American, whatever the umbrella term of left means, but like American progressives, I guess, having about the, Republicans versus Democrats. Because when you're not in the US, it's the same. It feels very much the same. That said, I appreciate all of you. You guys are so knowledgeable on Latin America. You're on the ground. I mean, I really appreciate everything you guys do. It's so important. I don't want to, move away from the seriousness of that, but I feel like this is kind of an important conversation in some ways. I do want to talk a little bit about the CIA woke video that came out, which I know is a little bit silly after the very real heavy stuff you guys are discussing about the region. But I'm not going to subject the audience or you guys to watching this video again, because it's just been on repeat on Twitter all week, of course, of this Latin American woman at the CIA, using all these woke buzzwords from like academia, intersectionality, and, I'm, unapologetically me, and I have generalized anxiety disorder, and I don't know what other crazy things she said to like excite, the left, or what the CIA thinks excites the left. But, there's been a lot of debate about the use of identity politics. Does this represent a failure of it? This sort of weaponization by empire of identity politics. So being in Latin America and kind of watching this conversation, what are your all's thoughts on this?
Well, I think this is, we've been seeing this take place for such a long time. This happens to be a very specific CIA ad campaign that they've designed recently, that it's now just coming out. But obviously, this has been part of the formula for a very long time. And just today, when finally, on the 7th day of mass mobilizations and repressions and killings in Colombia, we saw a notice, a statement emitted from the U.S. Embassy in Bogota, supposedly, although there's many functionaries there, but actually the person who wrote it, or the person whose name is assigned to it, is the Deputy State's Department spokeswoman, and she is a Black woman. I think her name is Jamila. I don't know her last name. And she's Black, and she's probably 57 other things as well. And so I think that's the whole reason why she was, quite frankly, that is the reason why she was hired, was to be able to deliver that news. If you look at the functionaries on the ground from the United States in Colombia, they are all white men, the whole of them. So the fact that someone from Washington in the State Department is the person who put out the statement that was from the Bogota embassy is kind of strange. I'm quite sure she hasn't been in Bogota. I didn't know she's been in Washington. And so the reason why she's the person who came out with and it shows her picture and everything, and some of the social media versions of that statement, is because they want to show that this is a Black woman that is pronouncing on the genocide that's taking place, the massacres that are being carried out by Colombian state forces. And so they're applying this everywhere. And just apart from, we'll let you speak on more on just the ridiculousness of the, this fixation with all these colorful identities, is just that, what was I gonna say? Just as well, that this campaign, they also have they have the gay videos, they have everything, but some of the more just kind of normal ones where they're not really using a personality, they're just kind of saying like, do this, you do this, you'd be a perfect fit. There's one where they're like, are you good at making friends? And like some of the things they say are just eerie. It's like, that's like the first thing they say. It's very eerie. They say, are you good at making friends? It's just like unbelievable. Like the things they say, it's just it's just so blatant about about what the job of this agency is, and it's obvious that this is again just like with USAID.
Are you good at making friends and infiltrating social circles?
Exactly.
Like that's what I hear with that.
But this is not just them trying to appeal to a wide range of different people, but this is an expansion as well.
Yeah, it's an expansion of a strategy that has worked in a lot of places. And I think the example of like young Latinos in the US is really interesting. There are these huge social media pages that I think if you're not Latino, Latin American, you probably have never even heard of them. But they have these followings of millions of people. Pages like Flama, which is owned by Univision, Pero Like, and they will use all these social media gimmicks, all these sort of woke buzzwords. They'll make videos talking about racism in Latin America, different identities or homophobia, etc. All of these cultural things, and then after all, they sneak in, oh, by the way, we need to invade Venezuela.
Right.
Bolivia is a dictatorship, blah, blah, blah. And that's been an incredibly successful way of doing things. So I think they look at the success of that and they think, well, that if it can work here, it can work elsewhere. So I think we're going to see that imposed on other countries. We're going to see new social actors, young people in different countries, Latin America or even Africa, all around the world, coming out with this same discourse, of covering sort of liberal, socially liberal things, and using that as a cloak to repackage free market policies. I think it's not about corruption, it's about a very defined strategy of combining the two things. Because an old strategy of, old school anti-communism is only going to get you so far. Or like, all these people are ignorant, we need to have a hard fist, time to clamp down on these people who think they can come out and protest. I think that sort of discourse is not going to work for people who aren't, former soldiers of Plan Condor in the 70s. So for the younger generation, you need to be able to. The other issues as well, things like animal rights, like vegetarianism.
Environmentalism.
Yeah, environmentalism is a big, big one. All of these things are avenues where they can reach into pockets of young people who care about certain issues but don't have a wider political formation, ideology, and then get in like that and then provide them with an ideology, provide them with something much more wide-ranging, which includes free market economics, which includes, neo-colonialism around the world.
But why don't they have an ideology? Why don't they have a knowledge of their history? Why don't they have anything to stick to? And this is, of course, why the people on these different alternate or supposed to be like BuzzFeedy, Me Too, Fusion networks are largely from El Salvador, from the El Salvadoran diaspora, and from other countries where they have been removed from their history. I think if you ask someone like Evo Morales, he might say that it's literally because the circumstances under which we were removed from our countries. It's very difficult for us to to go back and remember what it looked like when the people in our countries, the indigenous peoples, the campesinos, and the different social movements, when they had to fight colonialism. These are things that are very difficult for people to understand, and so then they're looking for new ideas in the neoliberal university in the United States and elsewhere. But I think it would be very important, and I would invite people in the United States of the Latin American diaspora, if you use that term, to revisit and try to learn about the people who were anti-imperialists, the people who fought against neoliberalism in their countries, if they're people whose families had to leave their countries in the last 4 decades or whatever it is. It's very important for them to go back and understand. And in the case of El Salvador, there's a lot of people who are reporting neo-fascists, and people like Nayib Bukele, they are reporting, or they are supporting a lot of just, bogus things. Obviously, they are all about this weird privileged discourse. They're all about decolonizing the CIA. And if that's the case, I think that they need to look at the history of their country and the experience of Latin America specifically. The most prominent and important leftist force over the past X decades was the FMLN, and the FMLN was largely based around the ideology most prominent in the organization, which was, of course, a mass of multiple organizations coming together, was Marxist-Leninism. And that's the same in the of course, the history of the Cuban Revolution and lots of other revolutions and uprisings and important leftist forces around the continent. If people in the US and the diaspora in Canada and the UK, et cetera, knew a little bit more about what the struggles actually are here, they would be a little more in tune with the ideas of anti-imperialism, internationalism, and everything else, and not, and not fall victim to these, to these decolonize the CIA campaign.
Yeah, I think there's so many parallels that you guys are talking about with the Middle East. I mean, unfortunately, in the Middle East, there's not as much vibrant leftism. Like there's still so many leftist movements in Latin America that I'm actually really envious of that you have in the region. That's just, not the way the Middle East functions right now. All the leftists have been killed, or leftist movements have been stamped out over the years. And of course, there's like a different dynamic that the Middle East operates in. That said, one thing I have noticed in recent years is, this kind of the sort of neoliberal free market forces in the Middle East that oppose, any group that stands up to either Israel, Saudi Arabia, or the US, any anti-imperialist force, generally tend to come from, it generally tends to be in the NGO sphere or the academic sphere. These American universities all across the Middle East have like 1,000 gender departments. Like, I don't know if it's the same thing in Latin America. I mean, I don't know why you need so many gender departments. Like, one seems like it would be enough, but there's just this obsessive focus on anything that is American funded in the Middle East, on like gender studies, on women's studies, and it's always in this postmodernist framework. I don't mean to get too academic or specific, but there's a very particular kind of academia this comes out of, right? And then also in the NGO world, where a lot of the funding comes from USAID or which is weird that you call anything non-governmental if it's funded by USAID, but whatever. For some reason, we call them NGOs. But a lot of this like funding, the USAID funds like all of these different projects for like women's empowerment and gender equality. And that sounds lovely and great, but that sort of liberalism in the Middle East ends up translating into people, they have good intentions when they go into it. We have the same problem you're talking about, Camila, where people don't know their history. Even people living there don't know their history. Like in Lebanon, there was a war. So many people died. And the war initially was about stamping out the left that was like working with the Palestinian liberation groups. That history doesn't exist in people's memories at all, because there's never been a written history about the war that's been taught. It's just been erased. And even the war in 2006 between Hezbollah and Israel, people who were like kids then don't know anything about it in Lebanon. So even recent history is erased. So people will join these groups, these NGO groups, they'll go into academia and they think they have good intentions, but then suddenly whenever there's a war or a coup somewhere with a snap of the finger, that outlet turns into, you have to support U.S. interests, and we kind of support Israel. And it's kind of a similar dynamic. And that's one of the things I think, is left out of this whole conversation, is how this identity politics is functioning in the global South.
Well, that's exactly what is going to happen, or what has already begun to happen with the issue of Colombia. With the issue of Colombia, there's just there's just so many people, so many Colombians living in the exterior, living all around the world. And these people have been completely 1000% assimilated, and they have no knowledge of what the struggles are, or what really happened during this long conflict. And so they don't understand what's going on. I think it's very important that they be able to put together the fact that Duque is an ally of Guaido, who is an ally of Janine Áñez, who is an ally of Luis Almagro, and those sorts of things should be put together, but they're not going to be put together. And so there's this potential for, this whole conversation about the violence and the killings by the Colombian state of Iván Duque to be hijacked by anarchists and to be hijacked by liberals. And so this is just horrible, because there's just, this is such a massive opportunity. We're not Colombians, we're not in Colombia. All we can do is report based on the official information we have from human rights organizations, and the social movements that we're in contact with. But apart from that, it's, there's a lot of people with computers and fast internet and meme makers on the outside who are saying SOS Colombia. But what else are they saying? They're also asking the United States for help. They're retweeting the United States Congress people. They are asking the OAS for help. And I even saw these people replying to Juan Guaido's tweets, asking Juan Guaido, who is not even the authority of anything, for help in Colombia. And it's just absolutely unbelievable. And if this continues in terms of the intensification of the mobilizations on the ground, I think it's very important that people redirect the conversation in the right way. We need to be able to make sure that the discourse is being, is being channeled in the correct ways. There's a huge opportunity here for the Colombian people, social movements, to potentialize their capacity to stand up to the government and make their demands. I don't know if they would be able to, make some of the demands that they've been talking about, which is of course on the most militant end. They've been calling for the resignation of the president himself and his cabinet. But they do have the ability to potentially leverage quite a bit, but only if people understand clearly what the objectives are, and they have a clear idea of who the enemy is, what the enemy is. And it's not in appealing to, Luis Almagro for help, that's for sure.
That's really well said. I really appreciate you guys coming on and spending this hour with me. Where can people follow your work, both individually and your outlet?
Definitely follow our Facebook. We are always trying to do Facebook Lives there. And obviously we launched our Twitter. We launched Kawsachun News originally when we were first putting out information about the coup during the coup period on May 6th. So that was 1 year ago, 2 days from now, right? Because today's May 4th. So our 1 year anniversary is this year. Thank you. And so, we are very slowly introducing new elements because, we are like an outlet that works largely reporting on the ground with the radio station we're a part of here. But we've also recently in the month of April launched our website. So definitely recommend checking us out on Facebook, on Twitter. We have a YouTube channel and a Patreon, of course, and we love and appreciate all the support because we are a small outlet that is run out of a rural area, which we are in now in the Tropico of Cochabamba, Bolivia. But, it's extremely hard, and we have done a lot of the work since the beginning and before we launched Kawsachun News on a voluntary basis, doing other jobs and looking for other ways to make money because, of course, there's not a lot of money for this sort of work from NGOs or the sort. So definitely check us out there and support our Patreon.
Thank you guys so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I hope to have you back on soon, hopefully on a nicer, lighter topic of good news. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.